In Europe, mercantilism was the dominant school of thought throughout the early modern period, that is, the 16th to the 18th centuries. Mercantilism is an economic theory which holds that the prosperity of a nation is dependent upon its store of capital, represented by bullion, that is, gold, silver, and trade value held by the state. Capital is best increased through a positive balance of trade, which means that exports should be more than imports.
The phrase or the term was first used in 1776 by Adam Smith. The concept of mercantilism has been coined by Marxist historians as an ideology of the monopoly trading companies. Maurice Dobb describes it as a system of state regulated exploitation through trade, essentially the economic policy of primitive accumulation. Jan de Vries believes that in the 17th century, the absolutist and the constitutional states became much more effective in their attempts to channelize economic life to their ends. Tariff legislation, industrial regulations, trade wars, laws, and currency manipulation were the methods used by the government to influence their economies. The mercantile theory aimed at explaining how growth was attained and what the role of money, commerce, production, and the colonies were in effecting this growth.
Mercantilism developed at a time when the European economy was in transition. Isolated feudal estates were being replaced by centralized nation-states. As a result of import of precious metals from the Americas, there was an increase in the use of metallic money relative to barter transactions. Technological changes in shipping and the growth of urban centers led to a rapid increase in international trade. Mercantilism focused on how this trade could best aid the states.
The state intervened in all spheres of life. And in the mercantilist economy, you have what is called planning. So it was a kind of a planned economy, and where there was state interference in all spheres of economic life. It engaged in both extensive and intensive economic planning. Now, the drawbacks of this was that it kept alive uneconomic enterprises. It also curbed private initiative and ultimately engendered national rivalries for the acquisition of a share of that commerce, which was perceived to be one commerce and a share in the colonies.
Mercantilists viewed the economic system as a zero-sum game, which says the global volume of international trade is unchangeable. So, any system of policies that benefited one group would by definition harm the other, and there was no possibility of economics being used to maximize the commonwealth or common good.
Adam Smith, who coined the term, believed that the state regulated the economic affairs in the interest of only the industrial and the commercial minority, and that it was short-sighted, mistaken policy which would in the eventual analysis be detrimental to the interest of the state. Mercantilism assumed that national wealth could be increased by state intervention when the state gave encouragement to production and protected production from external competition.
The ruling governments played a protectionist role in the economy. They imposed tariffs and subsidies to encourage exports and discourage imports. This was done in order to generate a positive balance of trade. Within the countries of Europe, this led to some of the first instances of significant government intervention and control over the economy. Internationally, mercantilism encouraged the many European wars of the period and fueled European imperialism.
one of the characteristics of mercantilism is this, that you have to hoard bullions. That is, the gold and the silver that you get, you have to hoard it in your country. The more the gold and the silver a country has, the wealth of that country is assessed by the reserve of its precious metals. So there was this mad scramble for accumulation of bullion. Now, according to historians, according to various philosophers of this time, say such as Thomas Hobbes says that wealth is power and power is wealth.
The armies and navies of the main protagonists were no longer temporary forces raised to address a specific threat. These became full-time professional forces. Each government's primary economic objective was to command a sufficient quantity of hard currency to support a military that would deter attacks by other countries and aid its own territorial expansion.
A very, very important assessment of the period, because if you look at this, if you just try to analyze this statement of Hobbes, then you see that those who are wealthy have power and those who are powerful alone have wealth. So it is a kind of a system where the wealthy are influencing political decisions and politicians are using their power to accumulate wealth. This is mercantilism. So it is a kind of an economic policy which is actually helping only a few people, a few influential people. It is not talking about the acquisition of wealth for the greater benefit of the masses. It is talking about the wealth of a certain class of people, a class of people who are the policymakers, a class of people who are the important entrepreneurial classes who have a say in the government policy. So this kind of a system evolved from the 16th century onwards right up to the 18th century. And there are other aspects of mercantilism. One of the chief characteristics of mercantilism is monopoly, where you have to monopolize not only commercial activities, but also monopolies in industrial production, monopolies in commercial ventures, monopolies in all economic activities.
The tenets of mercantilism may be summed up by the 9-point program drawn up by the Austrian scholar Philipp Wilhelm von Hornig in 1684. Every inch of a country's soil be utilized for agriculture, mining or manufacturing.
Why were mines important? Mines were important because they provided the raw materials for industry. Those raw materials which were needed for industrial production, so that the nation became self-sufficient.
All raw materials found in a country be used in domestic manufacture, since finished goods have a higher value than raw materials. A large working population be encouraged. All export of gold and silver be prohibited, and all domestic money be kept in circulation. All imports of foreign goods be discouraged as much as possible.
The manufactured goods in Europe would be sold to other countries, but manufactured goods from specifically the East will not be sold in Europe. Why? Because this is what is called protectionism.
Where certain imports are indispensable, they be obtained at first hand in exchange for other domestic goods instead of gold and silver. As much as possible, imports be confined to raw materials that can be finished in the home country.
Elevation of the tariff barriers as far as manufactured goods are concerned, the bringing down of tariff barriers as far as raw materials are concerned. And so greater import duties on manufactured goods, less import duties on raw materials, and greater export duties on raw materials and less export duties on manufactured goods.
opportunities be constantly sought for selling a country's surplus manufactures to foreigners, so far as necessary for gold and silver. No importation be allowed if such goods are sufficiently and suitably supplied at home.
In fact, mercantilism is an offshoot of capitalism. The more capital, or if you look at the capitalist world, then what is it? It is just a few people who have wealth in their hands. So mercantilist policy is actually a policy which helps in the process or which helps in the growth of capitalism.
Mercantilist policies were developed and enforced by rent-seeking merchants and governments. Merchants benefited greatly from the enforced monopolies, bans on foreign competition, and poverty of the workers. Governments benefited from the high tariffs and payments from the merchants.
প্রত্যেকটা দেশই যদি মানে প্রত্যেকটা ইউরোপীয় দেশে যদি এভাবে শুল্ক ব্যারাজ সৃষ্টি করে তাহলে আন্তঃইউরোপীয় বাণিজ্যটা কোনোভাবে ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত হবে না?
Now, if you look at the various treaties that were at that time being drawn up, say for example a treaty between England and Portugal, whereby it was decided that English wool would be sold to Portugal and Portuguese wine would be sold to England. So we are moving towards an era of specialization where whichever country has acquired that kind of a finesse in the production of a particular item, they would produce that, protect that, and by treaties with another country would import and export the things that were best manufactured in their countries. This would eventually happen. Initially, yes, that these trade barriers prevented the movement of goods or prevented the movement of goods within Europe.
Mercantile policies took many forms. Domestically, governments would provide capital to new industries, exempt them from guild rules and taxes, establish monopolies over local and colonial markets, and grant titles and pensions to successful producers. In trade policy, the government assisted local industry by imposing tariffs, quotas, and prohibitions on imports of goods that competed with local manufacturers. Governments also prohibited the export of tools and capital equipment and the emigration of skilled labor that would allow foreign countries and even the colonies of the home country to compete in the production of manufactured goods.
All these countries had their own way of pursuing that mercantilist policy. Let's start with Portugal. Portugal started its mercantilism with its spice trade. Now, when it started its spice trade, its chief objective was to what? To hoard bullion. So the profit that it made from spice trade, for that, the amount of money that money in the form of currency, gold and silver, that it acquired, they thought of hoarding it in their countries. When Portugal was eventually captured by Spain, then of course this hoarding of capital by Lisbon ceased. Now Spain tried to do exactly that in the New World, but it actually could not pursue the mercantilist policy in the New World in its colonies in South America because of various socio-cultural and political reasons there. But Spain, in fact, even tried to do exactly the same thing that Portugal tried to do in order to monopolize certain things. That is, all trade with its colonies would have to be sanctioned by Spain. All the ships that wanted to trade with Spain's colonies would have to get a letter from the Spanish authorities, and automatically only Spaniards would be allowed to trade with the New World. So the same way in which Portugal tried to monopolize trade and commerce, in the same way Spain did the same thing, but it could not in fact start the mercantilist policy in its newly acquired colonies because of various socio-political and reasons there.
Shipping was particularly important during the mercantile period. The governments of the era developed strong merchant marines. With the growth of colonies and the shipment of gold from the New World, that is America, into Spain and Portugal, control of the oceans was considered vital to national interest. In England, the Navigation Act of 1651 prohibited foreign vessels from engaging in coastal trade in England and required that all goods imported from the continent of Europe be carried on either an English vessel or a vessel registered in the country of origin of the goods.
In fact, England from the very early days, from the medieval period onwards, had evolved into a single unified country. So the protectionism, trade regulations, etc. were all followed by England. In fact, England was one of the first countries in Europe to pursue that. She protected the wool industry. She saw to it it was from a very early, much before the 16th century, she started protecting a woolen industry. She saw to it that her woolen products were not sold outside, so that the woolen industry could develop in England. There were so many statutes if you look at from the Tudors to the Stuarts, from the Tudors, say from Henry VII onwards to the Stuarts, you will see the amount of legislation down to say through Elizabeth I, then you have Mary, and then you have the Stuarts coming in. You will find the amount of legislations that were actually passed so as to protect England's industry. You will also see the initiative taken by the English Crown in setting up of colonies, the initiative taken up by the English Crown to modernize its navy, the initiatives taken up by the English Crown in the development of its navigational power, and all this helped in its mercantilist policy. All this helped to protect its industries.
In France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Minister of Finance under Louis XIV from 1661 to 1683, increased port duties on foreign vessels entering French ports and provided bounties to French shipbuilders. Under Colbert, protectionist policies were drawn up and executed that limited imports and favored exports. Industries were organized into guilds and monopolies, and production was regulated by the state through a series of directives. To encourage industry, foreign artisans and craftsmen were imported.
Now, during Colbert's time, what he actually tried to do was he tried to protect these industries which were called the luxury industries. He felt that automatically there would be a demand created for French products if the quality of the French products were far superior to the quality of products available in other countries of Europe and the world. So what he did was he protected the luxury industries and saw to it he gave, not only did he protect it, he offered them loans, he gave them all sorts of help, to even credit was given to them, all sorts of help so that these industries could be developed. But what happened was this, that the development of the luxury industries which were not meant for mass production, did not have as wide a market as they would have had he propagated products which had a mass appeal.
Colbert also worked to decrease internal barriers to trade, reducing internal tariffs and building an extensive network of roads and canals. Colbert's policies were quite successful, and France's industrial output and economy grew considerably during this period. France became the dominant European power, although he was less successful in turning France into a major trading power. Britain and the Netherlands remained supreme in this field.
Next, you come to Holland. Holland is a bit different. Now, where Holland is concerned, its mercantilism cannot be equated with bullionism. One of the reasons as to why Holland was not intent on hoarding bullion was because it realized that bullion would bring bullion. If you hoard bullion, then you cannot get more money into your economy. So money would bring in further money. Another reason was Holland was a country, or the Netherlands was a country, which had to depend on exports for the growth of its industry. It did not have much resources of its own. So it realized that its best bet was to convert Holland into the trading entrepot of Europe, so that the goods that were imported could be utilized for its industrial development. So she could not afford to raise tariff barriers. She also realized that lowering the tariff barriers would enable her importers to make a larger profit. If she lowered the barriers for manufactured goods, then her traders would reap a profit because they would sell their items at a low price. So Holland is different from the other European countries because of her position, because of the lack of her raw materials. Moreover, she realized that hoarding of bullion would not actually facilitate her economic development. So what she did was she used the bullion to further her trade. It's not that during mercantilism it was only commerce and industry which was propagated. Agriculture was also propagated. Why? Because agriculture, the development in agriculture would mean a surplus which would enable those who were not directly linked with agriculture to actually survive. The food surplus that the agricultural sector would throw up, that was something which could be used by the non-agricultural classes. Moreover, if there was a prosperous agricultural community, then this prosperous agricultural community would actually be a customer for the products that were produced by the new industries.
Mercantilism fueled the intense violence of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. Draining one another of valuable gold and silver was thought to be almost as desirable as the direct benefits of trade. A number of wars, most notably the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the Franco-Dutch Wars, can be linked directly to mercantilist theories.
The poor was also very important in mercantilism. One would just think that it is just the economy which propagated the interest of the rich. But the poor was equally, maybe the government did not consciously propagate the needs and the requirements of the poor, but the poor was as much needed for mercantilism because this was the workforce. From the poor would come the workforce who would be employed in the various industries, and they would also be employed in, say, as seamen, etc., etc. The lowly jobs, of course.
কিন্তু ম্যাম মার্কেন্টাইল অর্থনীতিতে পুরোটাই রাজকীয় নিয়ন্ত্রণে হচ্ছে, সেখানে স্বাধীন বণিকদের কার্যকলাপ কতটা উৎসাহিত হচ্ছে?
If there was, when you're talking about independent merchants, then if these independent merchants had or a considerable influence over the court, then of course their interests was looked into. Say for example the English East India Company. It was set up by a royal statute, but it was not a company which was controlled by the crown. It was an independent company. But what? The English East India Company influenced the decision of the crown primarily because it got a lot of profit or it meant that its trade with the Orient brought a lot of profit for the crown. So it is not always something which is, it is the initiative taken by the crown to propagate the interest of one small section of society. They may be private entrepreneurs, they may be private businessmen, but all in all, they have to be influential. They have to be near the power centers, or they have to be so powerful so as to have an influence on the decision-making process of the state. For mercantilism to be very successful, really, there had to be a unified system of weights and measures and currency. Throughout the country, a kind of a currency, a weight and measure which would be internationally acceptable. This was important. And of course, the most important part of mercantilism, or one of the most important parts of mercantilism, was an active state. That state would have to use its power to ensure the safety of the various merchants, specifically the seafaring merchants. The state would also have to take initiative in the formation of colonies. The state would also have to protect the industries. So the state power was one of the most significant aspects of mercantilism. Without the state power, this kind of monopolistic growth, this kind of protectionism would not have been successful.
In 1776, Adam Smith, in his famous treatise, The Wealth of Nations, refuted the idea that the wealth of a nation is measured by the size of its treasury. Smith made a number of important criticisms of mercantilist doctrine. First, he demonstrated that trade, when freely initiated, benefits both parties. Second, he argued that specialization in production allows for economies of scale, which improves efficiency and growth. Finally, Smith argued that the collusive relationship between government and industry was harmful to the general population. While the mercantilist policies were designed to benefit the government and the commercial class, the doctrines of laissez-faire or free markets interpreted economic welfare in a far wider sense of encompassing the entire population.
Each system, when it evolves with certain goals in mind. After the system has evolved, one starts finding faults with the system. The flaws of the system become evident, and it is but human. If you look at the evolution of the history of humanity, you will see that the flaws of the system are sought to be corrected by a newer initiative. Laissez-faire or open market is actually a process to rectify the faults of mercantilism.
The Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the Revolutionary War in the United States heralded the end of the period of military confrontation in Europe and the mercantilist policies that supported it. In France, economic control remained in the hands of the royal family, and mercantilism continued until the French Revolution. In Germany, mercantilism remained an important ideology in the 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1860, England had removed the last vestiges of the mercantile era. Industrial regulations, monopolies, tariffs were abolished. Emigration and machinery exports were freed. In large part because of its free trade policies, England emerged as the dominant economic power in Europe.